driving the car across the railway overpass near the comatose village of Fearn. Before she'd even reached the highway, she became aware of a rattle somewhere above the wheel on the passenger side. Only a few hundred metres short of the junction with the highway, a hairy youngster was ambling along the side of the narrow road, thumbing a lift. Turning onto the A9 at Kildary, she checked the clock on the dashboard. The land had fallen away on the left side, revealing the gleaming shore of the Cromarty Firth. The tide was low, all the rocks and sands exposed. Traffic had accumulated all around them. They were caught up in an orderly queue of vehicles crossing the multi-lane tightrope of Kessock Bridge. On the far side, where the bridge rejoined the mainland, she negotiated the roundabout with pained and earnest concentration to avoid being caught up in the town-bound traffic and herded to Inverness. "I'll drive you just a bit further, get you past the Aberdeen Turnoff. Then at least you'll know all the cars passing you are going south." Sure enough, not far from the sign inviting motorists to visit picturesque seaboard villages on the B9175, she spotted a miserable-looking biped, thumbing the watery air in the snub stream of the traffic. "Here's Dornoch Farm coming up," she announced. "Another 200 yards and that's me," said the whelk stud, already unbuckling his seatbelt. "Thanks a lot. You're a little Samaritan." By the grace of Providence, they had reached the comforting eyesore of Donny's garage in Kildary. "Welcome," the sign said. At Daviot, however, she spotted a tall, rangy backpacker holding a cardboard sign that said Thurso. She drove all day, backwards and forwards between Inverness and Dunkeld, over and over. In the mountainous desolation of Aviemore, she caught a hitch in her headlights, a little gargoyle gesturing in a flare of illumination, registering almost as an after-image on the retina. An hour or so later, she had bypassed Tain and was approaching the Dornoch Bridge roundabout, lit up against the pitch-black environs by strips of neon on long stalks. The roundabout glowed eerily in the windless, trafficless stillness. ISSERLEY'S veered to the left to avoid crossing Dornoch Firth. Her headlights, on full beam, picked out the flank of the Jehovah's Witnesses' Kingdom Hall nestled below, then tunnelled into Tarlogie Forest. The forest's underground effect was an illusion after all. She knew the barrier keeping out the light overhead was nothing more than a feathery canopy of twigs, beyond which lay a comforting eternity of sky. Minutes later, the car emerged from the forest into the pastured surrounds of Edderton, The dismal caravan sales yard welcomed her to this minuscule village. Streetlights illuminated the defunct post office and the thatched bus shelter. There was no sign of life. Isserley sat in her car for a long time, engine off, in the pool of light near the thatched bus stop in Edderton village. Ablach Farm was snowy pale and as quiet as ever when she drove up its overgrown private road, though no cars except hers ever drove on it. Already at the mouth of Ablach, a cluster of signs warned of death, poison, and the full penalty of law. There were actually 2 roads leading into the farm, one, nominally, for heavy machinery. But both were cracked and bumpy, and wild with weeds, and Isserley used either depending on her mood. The junction was an exposed crucifix of roads, and in the very centre of it stood the Vodsel. It turned stiffly and lifted one arm, pointing sideways towards Tain. But incredibly, when Eswis reached the junction, he didn't stop. He just drove straight on, following the border of farmland towards the village of Portmahomack. Eswis pulled the car in beside Petley's farm and executed a 3-point turn, except in half a dozen points or more. But Eswis seemed to have discovered caution all of a sudden, and drove slowly and carefully back to the junction, stopping just short of it, behind the cover of trees. Then Eswis revved the car, launched it with a lurch, and drove up to the crossroads. On the windswept A9 an hour later, and 40 miles away, a bleary-eyed Isserley squinted up at a vast electronic traffic sign that said, "Tiredness can kill. Take a break." Isserley had passed under this sign hundreds of times on her way to Inverness. She pulled the car in at a lay-by and switched off its engine. A belligerent sun was staring her right in the eyes, and she considered darkening the windows. There was a spot she knew off the main road, on the B9166, to Ballantor, where she sometimes pulled in at the ruins of a medieval abbey to doze. Imagining herself in Fearn Abbey already, Isserley fell asleep. She dreamed at first of the abbey's roofless ruins, as if she were sleeping inside them, with the ocean of sky above. Bone-tired and dizzy, Isserley stopped at Donny's garage in Kildary for petrol. She wished she could buy fuel for her own body as easily, skulking inside the shop while a queue of other motorists were paying. I'm turning off in a minute, she said, frowning and weaving her head from side to side as she searched the gloom for the familiar B9175 sign. Driving past Dalmore Farm in Alness, she spotted a hitcher up ahead. He stood out like a beacon on the crest of a hill. An old church with windows cemented shut was looming on the left-hand side, with a long gravel path beside it, disappearing into scrubland. Isserley drove directly to Tarbat Ness, to a jetty she knew there. It was at the bottom of a short, dangerously steep road marked by a traffic sign depicting a stylized car falling into stylized ocean waves. A big green traffic sign said there was 110 miles to go before Perth. Now she was driving past the abandoned steelworks, almost home, with a nice big vodsil propped up next to her, just like any other day. In the distance, a hitcher stood on her side of the road, gesturing hopefully to whoever she might prove to be. He was standing right next to the sign that said P, reassuring drivers that he wouldn't be any bother to stop for. The car was already travelling at a crawl. She allowed it to roll into the nearest parking area and brought it to a halt. Shaded by a row of tall trees, there stood a ruined mill, roofless and skeletal, against which bales of hay had been piled. In the space between the trees and the mill, visible only by trespass, stood Pennington's van. A while later, still travelling northwards, ISSERLEY turned her car onto the Dornoch Bridge. She pulled over, halfway across the bridge, in a parking area provided for tourists. Her car was nestled in a bower of ferns near the edge of a loch. The tips of twigs actually touched some of the windows, and tiny birds hopped from roof to tree and back again, their fragile claws pattering on the metal. Only recently, she'd driven past a giant Tesco right next to the A96 to Aberdeen, wondering if she dared venture in. It was so close to the road, she could almost see inside its tinted glass doors. Driving back towards her bower by the loch, along the narrow road to the forest, she was alarmed to see a vodsil up ahead, gesturing extravagantly for her to stop. Rounding a corner, they sped downwards into a small valley. Almost in a dream, ISSERLEY felt her vehicle sliding free of the tarmac's friction. The car flew smoothly off the edge of the road and, with a ferocious smack, collided with a tree. All it took was the courage to press one button, and the faith that the connection had not been broken. She reached forward a trembling hand. "Here I come," she said.